Hi, my name is Schyler Church. I am a California real estate broker as well as a member of the education department at Accredited Real Estate Schools. We offer those courses to be eligible to take the state exam in California, but also a bunch of different tools to help you prepare for the state exam to make sure you're prepared to pass it. One of the tools that we use is practice questions, and today we're going to talk about a few practice questions. And hopefully it'll give you a little bit of an idea and assist with your studies of how well you're doing with the material so far. But if you want access to our entire database of practice questions, which is over 3,600 questions specifically for California, make sure to check out our link below as that goes over our video, our practice question program, our video program, our live class options. Tons of options, as well as if you need the courses. So let's get to it and start with the first question. 1. If the seller changes his mind regarding selling a property and the buyer wants to gain access to the title, what could the buyer do? A. File an interpleader action. B. Record a mechanics lien. C. Start a suit for breach of contract. D. Institute a suit for specific performance. As always, let's break down the question and see what it's asking here. So a seller decides that they just don't want to sell the property anymore. What can the buyer do to actually make the seller sell the property to them? Well, there should be something that's automatically coming to mind. Yes, you need to take them to court, but what do you need to take them over to court with? Well, it's called a suit for specific performance, to make the seller perform the action of conveying title to the buyer. Now, for specific performance to actually happen, the consideration has to be sufficient. So you can't make a seller sell it to you. Let's say they signed a contract to sell a house to you for $100. The house is worth $300,000. That's not going to happen. You cannot make the seller sell the house to them in court if the collateral, or not the collateral, if the consideration is not sufficient. And then let's just look at the other answer options just to verify. Well, interpleader action, remember that is something that should be kind of coming to your mind when you think of escrow. If there is a issue with like the deposit, for instance, the earnest money deposit. What about a mechanics lien? Well, that is an encumbrance, remember that, but what is it exactly doing? Not in this particular situation. This would be something if a contractor, a subcontractor, somebody that is not getting paid for their work for the property, they would record then a mechanics lien on the property against a property owner, but that's not in this particular case. Breach of contract. Yes, it could be a breach of contract, but for the buyer to gain access to the property, this buyer would need to institute a suit for specific performance. So the best answer is specific performance. 2. How many days does a buyer have to cancel a purchase after a real estate transfer disclosure statement is hand-delivered to the buyer? A, 1 day, B, 3 days, C, 7 days, D, 17 days. Well, remember, with real estate transfer disclosure, that is required in the sale of a 1 to 4 unit residential property. There are several exceptions to this, but any transaction you do that's a 1 to 4 unit property will be required for a seller to provide a real estate transfer disclosure statement. We call it a TDS. Well, that TDS goes over a lot of pertinent information that the buyer will want to be aware of when purchasing this property. So anything that the seller has knowledge of for defects to the property, important info about it, asks a lot of questions and explanations about certain items. And if that, when that transfer disclosure statement is provided to the buyer, well, the buyer kind of is worried about it. They weren't aware of it, or something just that really concerns them. Even if they are out of the contingency time periods, for instance, like the physical inspection contingency, what will happen is the buyer still has 3 days from that TDS being hand-delivered to the buyer to back out and cancel the purchase. So 3 days. That is the correct answer. Also, if the seller amends the TDS after already delivering it, the buyer has another 3 days to then decide if they wanted to cancel it. So 3 days is the correct answer here. 3, which appraisal approach requires a separate value of the land? A, market data approach, B, income approach, C, cost approach, D, sales comparable method. Well, what are the 3 approaches that should be coming to mind automatically? Well, A, B, and C. We have the market data approach, the income approach, and the cost approach. So let's break down these 3 main approaches. So we have the comparison approach, which is the market data approach. This uses the principle of substitution because it's also the most readily adaptable and usable approach. And because it's one that you're able to use and compare other properties to it, it's most often used with single family homes and unimproved land, vacant land, because it's easy to compare land to land, looking at if there's no improvements on it, what's the acreage, what type of land. You can kind of compare what it is easily with other land in the area. But then also a single family home, so like tract homes, properties that just have one building on it. Those are, there's so many residences and developments out there of single family homes, so they're easier to compare with. So when you're doing as a licensed real estate agent and assisting buyers and sellers coming up with an appropriate purchase or a list price, you usually will be using the comparison approach, which is the market data approach, and using sales comparables to find out what the current market is shaping up to be, and what it also is indicating of price points for features and types of properties out there. So you can use the principle of substitution to do so. And then we have the income approach, capitalization approach. This basically is used for investment properties, income properties, because it's used to appraise the value of income producing properties by converting an income stream into value. It takes what it will be yielding as income for the property and puts a value on it based on the amount of money it's making and the riskiness of the investment. That's why it's called also capitalization approach, because it's taking a look at the capitalization rate. And this is used commonly with multi-unit residential apartment buildings, leased investments, so commercial properties as well. Sometimes we'll use this. But remember, with an appraiser, they'll be looking at all 3 of these approaches. There just might be a more heavily emphasis on certain approaches when they're doing the reconciliation purposes of it. And then there's the cost approach. So the cost approach looks at the actual cost to build a building, so a house, for instance, an improvement on a parcel of land. And they take that cost to build the improvement and adds it to the land value to determine the overall property value. And so this is very good to use with like special purpose and service buildings, new residences, new construction, older homes, properties that are rare, unique. They're hard to compare. And so the cost approach is used for that because they just look at the actual cost to build the improvements and then use the value of the land, add them 2 together, and then they get a value for the overall property. Now, looking at this, the cost approach, as you can tell, there's 2 different elements to it. We're looking at the cost of the land. Well, how do we get the cost of the land? Well, in the cost approach, we look at the we use the market data approach to find the value of what the land is in the marketplace, to then add that with the cost of the improvements. And that's how we get the overall value for it. So when looking at the question that we have, let's review it. Which appraisal approach requires a separate value of the land? Well, out of all of these, separate value of the land, from what we've talked about, the only one that makes that separate valuation of the land is the cost approach. So the cost approach uses it and has a separate valuation of the land by using the market data approach to get a value for the land, and then looks at the cost to add to build the building or whatever type of improvement is on the parcel of land, adds those 2 numbers together to get an overall value. So it looks at it individually, whereas the comparison approach looks at it as a whole, and it uses the principle of substitution for the entire property, looking at the land and the improvements rather than them separately and then adding them together. That's only done for the cost approach. And the income approach doesn't even really look at the land. It looks at the actual income producing elements to the property. So the best answer is cost approach. The cost approach requires a separate value of the land and then adds that value of the land with the cost to build the actual improvements. 4, a salesperson did something unethical. Who is liable? A, salesperson only, B, broker only, C, salesperson and broker, D, salesperson, broker, and escrow officer. So there's a few things you need to know about to be able to answer this question. In California, when licensed as a real estate salesperson, you have to place your license under a real estate broker to be able to practice. That is a requirement by law. So because of that, there's something called vicarious liability. So the broker is then roped into anything these salespersons or broker associates that are under their license do. The broker is expected to manage and supervise all of these licensees that work under the broker. So there is a little bit more liability to a broker because of the fact of vicarious liability. The broker is also roped into whatever the salesperson does, that as long as the salesperson is under their license. So for this particular question, the salesperson is liable, the broker is liable. Is the escrow officer liable? No. Escrow officer is a neutral third party to assist with satisfying the terms of the contract. So the escrow officer is not involved in this liability for something unethical happening. Unless, of course, if an escrow officer did something differently, they could be held to a different type of standard. But we're talking about the salesperson in this particular question. So the best answer is C, salesperson and broker. They are both held liable for anything for something that a salesperson did that was unethical. The salesperson, of course, is the one that did the action, but because the broker has to supervise the salesperson and approve anything that the salesperson does in regards to a transaction or for what's happening, the broker needs to have full control over their brokerage and the licensees under them. Then the broker is also held liable for the unethical action performed by the salesperson. So vicarious liability. Now, I know a lot of people sometimes are worried to get their broker's license because of this, but this is if you had a lot of, if you have salespersons working under you. You can be a broker and be a broker associate working under somebody else. You can have your broker's license and just work for yourself without having any other licensees under you. So then you become more liable, yes, as a broker, especially if you are having salespersons or broker associates work under you. But you do have a lot more freedom by not having a broker over your shoulder. So keep that in mind. A lot of people sometimes are worried to upgrade their license type from salesperson to broker, but I do recommend it at least sometime in your career to get your broker's license because it does make it easier for retirement purposes. But it's all personal preference. You can stay a salesperson throughout the entire real estate career without issue. But I myself became a broker within 2.5 years of salesperson experience because I like doing my own thing, but that's just me. So let's move on to the next question. 5, Abel, Baker, and Charlie are owners of a vacant lot. They hold title as joint tenants. If Abel dies and is survived by Baker and Charlie, which of the following is correct? A, the joint tenancy is totally terminated. B, Baker and Charlie receive Abel's interest by succession. C, Baker and Charlie receive Abel's interest by survivorship as tenants in common. D, Abel's interest terminates. So this question has a lot to it. They're talking about joint tenancy, Abel, Baker, and Charlie owning a vacant lot as joint tenants. But if one person dies, and in this case Abel, and Baker and Charlie are left, what happens? Or which of the following options is the most correct? Well, we first need to talk about joint tenancy. So what should be coming to mind as joint tenancy? So remember, there's a lot of forms of concurrent ownership that can happen. There's tenancy in common, there's joint tenancy, you can have a partnership, corporation, you can do a syndication. There's so many options here. But what do we know about joint tenancy? Well, joint tenancy, you should be thinking of T-tip, right of survivorship, and being free of unsecured debts. Now, what does T-tip mean? Remember, that just means that the joint tenants must take title to the property at the same time, with the same title instrument, usually just a grant deed. Their interest must be equal, and there has to be equal possession. So time, title, interest, and possession, T-tip. But then we also have the right of survivorship. So what happens on a right of survivorship is that if someone were to pass away in joint tenancy, the other remaining parties as joint tenants will take over for that person that passed, and that would still be kept in joint tenancy. And then the interest in the possession of, et cetera, that would then be proportionate to whatever part that the other person left. So in this case, everybody had a 33 and a third, or a third, third, and third, and then now it would be with two parties left, half and half to the remaining parties as joint tenants. So what do we know is the most correct? Well, let's look at the answer options. The joint tenancy is totally terminated. That is not correct because the joint tenancy is still held because of the right of survivorship. So A is incorrect. B, Baker and Charlie receive Abel's interest by succession. So what do we know about succession? That's if you die and you do not have a will. Well, Abel may have not had a will, but because he held this title as joint tenancy with right of survivorship, it would go to Baker and Charlie, but not through succession. It would be because of the joint tenancy right of survivorship. C, Baker and Charlie receive Abel's interest by survivorship, yes. Oh, but as tenants in common, no. So they would still remain joint tenants, Baker and Charlie, because Baker and Charlie did receive time, title, interest, and possession all at the same time as joint tenants. So they would still remain as joint tenants. So with process of elimination, it looks like D is going to be the best answer, but let's make sure. Abel's interest terminates. Yep, Abel's interest terminates. That is the best answer because Abel's interest terminates, and so Baker and Charlie will take over for that interest through right of survivorship. So the best answer is D. Abel's interest terminates. Baker and Charlie still stay as joint tenants as owners for this vacant lot. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful in your licensing journey and your studies. If you liked it, make sure to give us a big thumbs up as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel so we keep producing new content. But if you have any questions or if you'd like to check us out for completing coursework to be eligible to take the state exam or even for preparation to help you prepare for the state test, we have tons of options and I have our website listed below. Otherwise, I'm Schyler with Accredited Real Estate Schools and thanks for watching.